Hello all, Dr. JC here. 3 lectures to go. We're going to take a look at the Renaissance and Reformation periods and talk a little bit about this Baroque period as it relates to European history here in this lecture. And then in the final 2 lectures of the course, we'll look at the Age of Discovery and the opening of the New World, specifically look at some colonies in British colonial America. And then in the last lecture, we'll talk briefly about the scientific revolution and enlightenment in Europe and how those movements not only impacted Europe, but America a little bit more broadly as well. So let's start here with the Renaissance. The Renaissance quite literally means rebirth. And it's rebirth. This is where Europe is re-emerging from that wrenching change that was the Black Death. If you recall in the lecture on the Mongols and the Black Death, I mentioned that individuals in European society, they went to their feudal lords and they went to their local Catholic priests and bishops and asked for answers. What's going on here with this Black Death? They weren't given answers. And therefore those individuals said, you know what, maybe we'll look to science, we'll look to nature, and we'll look back into the classical period. What did the Greeks do? What did the Romans do? Why was Greek and Roman society so great? So maybe we need to look back and look elsewhere in order for us to move forward. And that's what the whole basis of the Renaissance is. So as part of this rebirth, there are 2 major themes or subtopics that are components of the Renaissance. The first has to deal with state building. We're talking about kings and queens, reestablishing the monarchy. And in fact, we're going to start to see this trend towards absolute monarchy. We'll get to that a little bit later. And then the second subtopic is humanism. Key point to make here as it relates to humanism. Do not misassociate humanism here in the Renaissance period with secular humanism, parlance from the present day. Humanists here in the Renaissance period, they do not eschew God. They do not say God is a poo-poo. They do not say God is dead or doesn't exist. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They say that, you know what, if God created this earth, God or nature's God created all things, then maybe we need to look to science and nature for answers as well, because God would have placed them there. So this is not a separation of church and state. In fact, it's quite the opposite, and I do want you to keep that in mind. Akin to the Black Death itself, the Renaissance or rebirth is going to take place in Italy and spread northward. And as mentioned on this slide here, it probably kind of makes sense why it's going to start in Italy because of geography. Italy is closest to the Byzantine world, closest to the Islamic world. They command trade throughout the Mediterranean world, and as a result of that, the Renaissance or rebirth is going to take place in Italy, and as mentioned, spread northward from there. While clearly we could spend some time in Venice and Milan as well, we have to talk briefly here about Florence. It's best remembered as the Queen City of the Renaissance, and rightfully so. Interestingly enough, it's not just the artisans that we come to recognize from Florence here, the Leonardos, the Michelangelos, Cellinis, Giottos, and others. It's also the Medici family. This is where banking and capital and credit and capitalism really do start to take firm hold in Europe. Therefore, Florence really can be in some ways viewed as or remembered as the breaking of the modern world, especially as it relates to the European trajectory of power that's going to come. Much of that associated not just in the arts, but also in the sciences. And whether you're doing arts or sciences, you got to have some coin to back that. And that's where the Medicis come into play. While we clearly can't look at everybody as it relates to the Renaissance, we'd be here for 40 years. I would like to mention here, and use Leonardo da Vinci as an example, that there is such a thing as a Renaissance man of action that emerges during the Renaissance, and it's vastly different than the feudal age or Middle Ages before that. During the Middle Ages, everyone was expected to play their role, so to speak. If you're a peasant, you're going to farm, you're going to take care of the horses, whatever it might be. If you're a blacksmith, that's what you do. If you're a feudal lord, that's what you do. And most folks didn't move beyond that. You weren't allowed to move beyond that. During the Renaissance, it's quite the opposite. If you've got talent, if you have merit, go ahead and use those talents in different ways. If you happen to be an architect, a painter, a sculptor, et al., And Leonardo's a great example of that. This is what we would call a slash today on the football field, right? This isn't a guy that just can line up at quarterback. This guy can go as a wideout. He can play both sides of the ball. He might even be a safety. And if you got the talent to do that, you should do that. The best people should exercise their talents. That's how society advances. That's how society improves. And therefore, Leonardo becomes this great example of a Renaissance man of action. That it was really okay for you to do more than one thing, especially if you were good at it. So a cool, unique change that takes place from the Renaissance as opposed to the Middle Ages. Michelangelo, of course, is another example of these Renaissance men of action. And in some ways, think about how cool and freeing this might be for the individual. That you might be able to exercise both the left side and right side of your brain. You're not stuck doing the same thing necessarily every single day, that you can create and innovate. And therefore, people really are able to be who they're born to be. It's what the Greeks would call one's telos, the telos of an acorn to become an oak tree. The question for these folks, and perhaps for us, is what were you born to be? Because if you're not doing what you were supposed to be doing and what you were born to do, you're no damn good to anyone else in society, least of all yourself. So if you want to make yourself happy, do what you're born to do. And don't let money or social mores get in the way of that. And in essence, that's what this Renaissance period was all about. As a way to help individuals become all they were born to be, enter the Medici family. Look, not all of us are born with like this big, fat, huge trust fund or a trust account, right? We don't have millions of dollars in the bank, but we might have $1,000,000 ideas. And the only way we can make that $1,000,000 idea come to market is to perhaps hire some money. We got to borrow money. And this is where the Medici family was really important because they established banking, they established venture capital. Venture capitalists are like those cats on Shark Tank, right? Take an idea to these guys, they're going to invest in it, they throw some coin your way, bada bing, bada boom. You can take your idea to market. They get a cut of the profits or the initial public offering if you happen to go public and trade stock. But it's a win-win deal. And you can make yourself into your own king or your own queen, your own talents, your own merits. You can gain control over your own life and carve out a real special life where you can treat yourself and your loved ones as king or queen. Important point here. While this isn't meant to imply that, hi, everyone's going to be a king and queen, obviously not. We're still going to have monarchs. You're still going to have political kings and queens. You are. But individuals aren't seen as subjects necessarily anymore. Worthless individuals that are meant to do a certain thing throughout their life. They live to work, so to speak. You now can, in some ways, work to live. And you have your own control over your own destiny. There's a degree of individualism here, and that's the important point. Individualism was really largely absent in the Middle Ages. When we get to the Renaissance, the individual does matter. Hugely important. As the Renaissance takes firm root in Italy and begins its flow northward and westwardly throughout both Western Europe and Northern Europe, and as individuals start to recognize this movement afoot, that, hey, they might matter. They might be able to do what they would actually want to do in life. Wow, novel idea, pretty cool. And as individuals begin to, in some ways, view money as the new king, and some folks, money as the new god, there are going to be some individuals now that not necessarily push back on society, push back on these changes, but they will write to say to everyone, let's not get too fast, too far ahead of ourselves here. Let's keep our eye on the prize. That eye on the prize is God or nature's God. We make money our God. We can be setting ourselves up for another Black Death, setting ourselves up for another wretched adjustment because we're not doing what God or nature's God has asked us to do, which is not only take care of ourselves, but take care of our neighbors. That's among the various writings that will emerge during this time. We start to see philosophy and a sense of ethics brought back too from the Greeks and from the Romans. And that all writing that emerges, like those from the great so-styled Tuscan triumvirate, the Dantes, Petrarchs, and Boccaccio's of the world, the writing from these guys is meant to have a degree of lesson, but it balances the spiritual with the secular. Remember, as mentioned previously, humanism as it relates to the Renaissance does not separate church and state. It actually brings them together. And the writings also reflect the changing times. And Boccaccio's Decameron's a great example of that. Not only does the Decameron satirize and kind of poke fun at the Catholic Church and priests in a way, and this is a natural byproduct of the lack of response by the Catholic Church in the wake of the Black Death, but it also provides an interesting sort of framework or narrative whereby entrepreneurism, quick wit, individual sophistication, and intelligence, these replace various vices that they would refer to as stupidity, idleness. So in some ways they are framing this narrative, the Decameron does, that we are looking for Renaissance men of action. And it is important to note, too, that just because they're poking fun at the Catholic Church doesn't mean that this is like some atheist message. It's not that. In some way, the Decameron builds upon Dante's Divine Comedy, which really had a Christian message to it. So it's a way for the literary world to capitalize on the increasing number of people that are going to be able to read. Hint, hint, Gutenberg's movable type or printing press will come out during this age, but also a way to reflect the changes in society. Well, I'm not going to go into detail of other writers during the time that had very impactful and influential works like Sir Thomas More's Utopia, or the so-styled Prince of the Humanists himself, Erasmus here, especially his praise of folly or freedom of the will. I am going to, however, take a little bit of time to talk about this cat, Machiavelli. And I'm not talking about the rapper here, I'm talking about this cat. While I don't expect everyone to recognize this work, I'm certain that there are many of you that had to deal with Machiavelli's The Prince at some point, whether it's in high school or in a college lit course, whatever it might be. If you're unfamiliar with it, there are a couple key points I want to make here as it relates to The Prince, because it does reflect the change of time here from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And Machiavelli is writing as a way to instruct princes, kings, and queens on how it is they should go about governing. Now, there are other aspects within The Prince as well. There's military aspects and so on and so forth. It really is about how one does bureaucracy, how one should create and run a state. It's important to note here that Machiavelli's Prince has not necessarily been taken to be the most glamorous or positive of writings as it relates to how one does governance, how one does control of the state. After all, the term Machiavellian, right, tends to imply someone's a little bit more shystery, trickstery, so on and so forth. But you have to understand that Machiavelli's worldview was one such that he didn't think most people were very good. It's a little bit different than my own worldview. I happen to think that if an Amber Alert goes up, we don't ask what color the kid is or if it's a boy or girl. We just start to try to help out. I think people are hardwired to be good. But for Machiavelli, I think he saw most people to be perhaps not so trustworthy. And if that's the case, then yeah, we should have stronger rules perhaps in place to control disorderly peoples, right? Therefore, the instructions that Machiavelli is prescribing here for kings and queens, and understand too, he's trying to let them know, them being kings and queens, you can claim to have divine right. You can claim that God or nature's God has pointed you. But you're dealing with a new society in the sense that they don't necessarily view themselves as subjects, they view themselves as citizens, and that there is another new king or queen on the horizon here, and that's money. Therefore, you need to recognize your place within this changing society. And as a result of that, you cannot cookie cutter approach your policies to any one group or every group. There are times when you need to play the fox, and there are times you need to play the lion, Machiavelli would say. Times to apply the velvet glove to effect change, times to go ahead and use the iron fist to get your people to act the way you want to. But you can no longer cookie cutter the way you do governance. You have to now take this view that I have to apply case by case different policies, different provisions, different tactics to get people to behave, whether within my own borders or from a diplomatic standpoint, from a foreign affairs standpoint, other kings and queens as well. Thus, Machiavelli's work really does kind of reflect the larger ongoing changes here. It's not just individuals that are being impacted by this, it's the nobility and kings and queens as well. So the Renaissance in that regard really is a rebirth, not just of the individual and his or her place in the world, and not just of kings and queens and how they go about governance, but it's a rebirth, most importantly, of hope. And that's a powerful thing.